Today's sermon is titled Navigating a 12-Step Recovery Journey, Moving Back to Spirituality, to be delivered by Bob Kocher. Bob began his journey in recovery from addiction in 1988 after a life-ending choice was thwarted by a sleepwalking 3-year-old child in a ski rental home. He became part of a 12-step recovery process, mostly because he had nowhere left to turn. He began to follow mentoring from people living spiritually based lives and replaced bars with workshops, seminars, and family of origin work in therapy. In 1993, he opened In This Life, a travel company dedicated to providing workshops, retreats, and seminars on cruise ships, which he still operates today. In the mid-90s, he began to share his experience of recovery at similar conferences and seminars that had taught him a new way of thinking and living. He has led workshops on dealing with drastic change, relationships, intimacy, how the 12-step process works, and others. He has a passion for travel and sports and shares his life with beautiful partner Beth and beautiful dog Maddie, a black-mouthed cur. Now, Bob Kocher.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Diane. And I first want to thank everybody responsible for inviting me here today. It's always an honor for me to share about recovery and a journey back to a new life, which, as Diane mentioned, I almost had extinguished because I decided to end my life, as addiction had me in the complete grips of insanity from the age of about 13 years up till when I got sober at 41. And I have been sober 34 years, clean and sober 34 years, and now really am vested in the recovery community and in the life of recovery. So it's really a joy to share about this. Now, I was sitting with Beth and just taking in the environment here. When I came to the rehearsal here yesterday, I just felt at home. It was absolutely wonderful. The environment, the way that people were speaking, the warm welcome and connection that I felt with everybody here. And this is really what recovery is all about. Up here, we have a circle with a demonstration of different backgrounds of faith. And in the Alcoholics Anonymous program, for example, there is a circle and a triangle. And the triangle inside of the circle represents unity, service, and recovery. So it's very similar to an environment like we have here, which is focused on connection, and I could feel that right away when I came in. So I'm taking this in and sitting there and sort of leaning on Beth a little bit for some energy, and I looked down and both of my shoelaces were untied. Now, this was my experience a lot when I was out there drinking and using. I used to fall on my face a lot, and I didn't need to have my shoelaces untied to do it. But it was par for the course, so I laughed and I reached down and I tied my shoelaces, and I'm grateful that I didn't have to take a face plant coming up to the podium, and so here we are. Addiction is a subtle foe. There are over 125 12-step programs that are active in the world right now. Some of the main ones that many of us may have dealt with ourselves, of course, alcohol, drugs, food, sugar, sexual obsession, anxiety. The list goes on and on. And the closest way that I can describe the addictive process is that in my experience, and I speak only for myself, I'm not representing anyone except me, uh, I found out that addiction was what took me away from being present. And for me, that happened very early in childhood. So I said that addiction started for me at 13 and a half. It actually could have started when I was 2 or 3, because in my family, we mainlined sugar. And of course, alcohol has high volumes of sugar in it. So that fed my desire to be involved with it, but not as much as my desire to make the world make sense. It's interesting that when I got sober, the scientific community generally recognized that addiction was about 85% biochemical. Now it's exactly the opposite. The psychology behind the disease and things that happen in our culture are manifesting now in ways that it's much easier to recognize, even to the point where mutations are happening and have a connection with the biochemistry of addiction. So what happened with me when I came into the program was I knew from the standpoint of my dependence on alcohol and drugs that it was the only way that the world made sense to me. I had developed from childhood that included 11 moves by the time I was 12 years of age. My parents were married and divorced, then they remarried each other, and then they divorced again, both times after first I was born and then my sister Carol was born. So for children in the addiction environment, it's easy to see how if you're dependent upon a higher power, which would be your parents, and families are not together and integrated and full of community, that there can be disturbance in childhood. So in the addiction field today, there's a lot more movement into how this affects people in their processes in life. This shows up in all different kinds of ways: food, smoking, alcohol, and drugs, of course. I did everything. I was what they call in the program a garbage can addict. If it was there, I took it, and I wanted more. And the more that I took, the better I would feel for a short period of time. And recovery from the disease of addiction is generally based upon the fact that first you're having fun, then not fun plus problems, and eventually nothing but problems. And that was the story of my life. I was grabbing for a Kleenex and wiped my eyes several times when Diane was saying the one day at a time long version, because that's exactly what it is. I finally identified the fact that I was powerless over everything in my life. And it was all connected to the alcohol and drugs that I consumed on a daily basis. I hid my addiction very well. About half of the people that I knew in life were astonished that I needed to come into 12-step recovery. And the other half were going, oh, wow, I'm so glad he made it. So it is a disease that creates a lack of connection. It's a disease that tells you don't have it. And it is a disease that will push people to try to figure out on their own a way to be able to make life manageable. And it's just not possible. Diane, you mentioned the third, was it a concept? Third principle. So to go on now, I want to talk about the spirituality of recovery and what happened to me when I came from a position of despair and got into recovery. Many of you may know about the 12 steps. I won't repeat them all now, but I will repeat the third one because it's pertinent to the discussion today. And the third step says, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. There's a fallacy about 12-step programming in many areas of the world that it is a cult or it is a religious-based organization. Of course, there are people that are very religious that are within the 12-step programs, but the one important ingredient, which the founders, I think, got really right when they wrote the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the basis of discussing the 12 steps and sharing stories and helps and assists people in AA and getting into recovery, is that this concept was we are not going to define anybody's higher power. It's up to you to define it. And there are many agnostics and atheists within the 12-step recovery community. They lean on each other as a group of dependents, group of drunks, gathering of dependents. If one is not able to formulate a more traditional or personal concept with a higher power, and I like that a lot. It really enables people that join to have a greater sense of being able to be still an individual, yet connected to something that is in the greater good for each other. So I'll say just a little bit about how I came to 12-step recovery. I owned a light manufacturing and wholesale distribution company, and I made freshly squeezed juices and competed with Odwalla and Hanson's and Naked Juice and companies like that. And I was actually so far down the ladder in those days that I was pre-selling my product for less money than it cost me to make it to drive my cocaine habit and my alcohol habit. I was burning money like crazy. I owed the Italian produce community in South San Francisco $25,000, which is a lot of money today, but it was a whale of a lot of money in 1988. And I'd lost a lawsuit because I'd created an accident and a young person had a slight fracture in a leg because my vehicle had run into him. I hadn't been present enough in my day-to-day activity to pull the emergency brake, and my vehicle rolled back and impacted this young man's leg. That was a $50,000 bill. I was on the hook for about $3,500 to my drug dealer, and I had no money in the bank, not even to pay my next rent. The only thing that I could see that was possible to happen was to leave the planet. And I was going up to be with several people, and I was having psychotic episodes where I was hearing voices. They wouldn't go away. And no matter how much I drank and used in this last run, as we call it, up in Lake Tahoe, I couldn't quiet the voices. And I was going to be just fine with ending my life. And on the morning I was to do this, about 3 a.m., in a 3,500 square foot home where I was in a corner and all of the bedrooms were in the back of the house, a sleepwalking 3-year-old child walked somehow through the house and into the room where I was and crawled up underneath a small Afghan I had, put his arms around my neck and lay me back down on the couch. And when I woke up in the morning, my sister's voice was echoing in my head, and she had been in 12-step recovery for 10 years. And I thought, just maybe I'll give this a chance. I really didn't think that whatever God could or might be wanted to have anything to do with me. And a few days later, I happened to interact with a young man who I had coached in high school. I did have a 7-year coaching career, and he looked completely different to me. And on this Tuesday night of February 16th, 1988, I met with him and I asked him what he'd been doing because he facially looked so vastly different. And he said, I've been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous for 2 years. So I called my sister and went to a meeting. And when I went into the meeting, and the reason I was tearing up today when Diane was talking and reading about one day at a time was I felt precisely that same sense of connection in that first meeting that I went to. It gave me a modicum of hope. And all of us, at one way or another, whether it's an uncle, a distant cousin, a friend, we are connected as a society to addiction in some way or another. And the most important thing whenever I'm sharing about my journey in recovery that I can say is, I knew I had a problem for 10 years before I came. And I pushed and pushed and pushed to say, I can handle this on my own. And that is the greatest fallacy in the world, not just to addicts, but to other human beings. I love the fact that there was a care and concern about our country today. We live in an addicted society. We're addicted to conflict. We're addicted to violence. We're addicted to separation. Excuse me. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's wonderful when each and every one of us can do that part for our addiction to say, I'm not going to be a participant today, and I'm going to spread some good today somewhere. This is also the principle of recovery in all the 12-step programs. Once we get in, we're in community. So walking back to this February 16th evening, I was out in the front yard of my home, and I did what I usually did, which was to go into the house, come back out to talk to my friend, this AA member, and I had a beer. And I cracked open the beer and I put it up to my lips, and I don't know what battery acid tastes like because I've never tasted battery acid, but I'll tell you that beer burned in my mouth to the point where I spit it out. And the door opened and one of my roommates came out and he handed me a joint, and I put the joint up to my lips. And I don't know what smoking a highway flare would be like, but I can tell you that that joint burned my mouth. And I just turned and handed it back, and I was feeling emotional. And a couple of minutes later, I said goodbye to my friend, and I walked into the house, and I was walking down a corridor to go to my bedroom, and I said this, God, help me. I can't do this to myself anymore. Now, I had been praying for years. God, if you bail me out of this, I'm going to do this. God, if you only do this for me, I'm going to take care of this. And you know what? I got bailed out a lot. This time, all I said was, God, help me, and I meant it. I went into my bedroom and I lay down on my bed, and as if my fingers had snapped, it was morning. And I was looking out of my window, and there was a bird sitting on a branch in the tree, looking in, just chirping, as if it was speaking to me. I had no sense of spirituality. I didn't understand that even as an addict going through the things that all of you who may have had addiction problems yourself know that we do. I didn't think that God would want anything to do with me if there was a God. I wasn't even sure about what kind of concept of God I had, because in my religious upbringing, what I heard about in church was not matched in the family. So higher power was very scary to me, and scary to a lot of people that come into 12-step recovery. All I knew was something was different. And at that moment, not only was there hope and possibility, I could not know that this was the beginning for me to open my ears, open my eyes, open my heart to different possibilities. And when I went into that AA meeting on Sunday, the 20th of February, the speaker that came to the podium that day announced himself and said the topic of the meeting today is fear. And it's probably the only thing I could have listened to, because my mind was still churning away. And he talked about the realities of fears in his own life. And then people came forward to the podium and they talked about their fears, and they talked about solutions to things. I didn't know about solutions. Maybe intellectually I knew, but it wasn't a concept I could grasp, because by the time an addict reaches the problem stage, from going from fun to fun plus problems to nothing but problems, there aren't many solutions available except to surrender. So the journey of the 12 steps is first surrendering to the powerlessness. The second part is communicating with each other. 12-step programs encourage sponsorship. A sponsor can become a higher power without the dependence on a higher power. I don't make my sponsor, nor do I allow people that I sponsor to count on me as an authority, except from the standpoint of experience. A higher power is the group and the consciousness and the effort of each other to bring together the fact that we are okay as people, no matter what path we've been down. The words that I've spoken about my own turmoil leading up to recovery, I'm well down in the percentile range with what people deal with when they come in for addiction. But it is all centered in our minds. If I feel that I'm not worthy, or if I feel that I have no hope, or if I feel that I can't move forward, it's harder for me to get connected to that path, which all of you teach each other that I can be a part of and tap into. To suit up, show up, pay attention, to tell the truth as best as I can, and then leave the results up to my higher power, instead of driving the energy on my own as if I have the answers. I can learn solutions, but I don't have the answers. And also, I want to say something important about the spiritual journey for me was to get connected to therapy. Early in recovery, I would hear people come up to the podium when they were sharing, and they would say things like, well, I decided to see a psychiatrist, or I made an appointment with a psychotherapist. And I would sit out there thinking to myself, that's really great. Wow, that's great. I'm so glad you need it. I don't need it, but I'm glad for you. So in my sobriety, I've had several cycles where the things that life deals have created problems. I was sailing along in recovery, and I had my company go out of business. Well, I happened to be in Greece at the time on my first trip overseas, and a person shut down this light manufacturing and wholesale distribution company that I owned. And the woman of my dreams at that time decided that relationships were too scary, and I was by myself in a country far away, nothing to lean on, no meetings to go to. And my 12-step recovery process brought me back. And that opened the door for what I do today, a business of 34 years that's allowed me to share with people joys all over the world. And I was locked into that. I was in an addiction within my recovery, which can happen a lot for us, because once we solve one thing, there are lots of other things waiting to get us into the process. So therapy all of a sudden became very important to me. That which I did not need, I needed. And I was in therapy for a while, and then I was on a roll, and then all of a sudden I needed it again. And then I met Beth. And when we got together, both of us had come from addicted family backgrounds. So we're bringing this process together to try to have a relationship. And what we decided to do was to come and work through problems that were potential so that we could keep a commitment. And I'm so glad we did that. So the whole recovery community is about uncover, discover, and discard that which is not useful. And that is the sum total of the process. The more I discard that which blocks me from a relationship with God as I don't understand God but have faith in, the more I am open to playing the cards that I'm dealt in life and using the tools that I have to accept that that's the hand I'm dealt and move forward with it. I could never have imagined the kind of love that's available in the world if I hadn't gotten sober, clean and sober. Could not have imagined it. My higher power was everything that took me away from the higher power that could help me. And so I'm going to close just by saying that if you know of anybody that has a problem, if you feel like you have a problem, it's okay. There are solutions, and you can reach out, and there's help available in the community. 12-step recovery is a really good resource, and there are many more. This church, this community is a resource, all kinds of resources. I feel so blessed and honored to have been asked to share today, and I hope that whatever I've had to say helps with any kind of connection that you would want to make, and that you have just a terrific rest of the day, one day at a time. Thank you so much.